susunod na programa ay rated PG. Ito ay nangangailangan ng patnubay at gabay ng magulang para sa mga batang manonood.
Lost Masterpiece: The Ghost Palace of the Chinese Emperors by Alison McNeely. In 1873, German photographer Ernst Holmer was visiting Beijing when he decided to explore an area of the outskirts of town that was officially restricted to tourists. He brought along his camera and took photographs of what he found there before he was discovered by local authorities and thrown out. The 12 lost negatives that remain from these excursions are haunting both the images of the present and the story of loss that they tell. In the black and white prints, the facade, ornate arches and solitary walls of once palatial palaces stands abandoned and crumbling, with overgrown vegetation beginning to envelop the sides. There is a wild, desolate air to the scene that is magnified the knowledge that these fragile remains only hint at the overwhelming grandiosity of what the location once held, and its overwhelming loss. Just 13 years before Olmer set his lens to the deteriorating remains, Yaoming Yuan, which roughly translates to the Garden of Perfect Brightness, was one of the grandest sights in all of China. Now commonly referred to as the Old Summer Palace, Yuanming Yuan was an almost unimaginably magnificent retreat recreated by the emperors from the Qing dynasty that displayed an incredible range of feats in architecture and artistry, not to mention the sheer riches of China. Then the Second Opium War was launched. The British and French invaders weren't satisfied with forcing new concessions from the country they had invaded. They also plundered Yaoming Yuan of much of its treasure. Then Lord Elgin, commander of the British troops, issued a harrowing order that resulted in an act of extremely cultural destruction, masquerading as revenge. The Old Summer Palace, which occupied an area about 8 times the size of the Vatican City, was to be burned to the ground. You can scarcely imagine the beauty and the magnificence of the place we burned. It made one of the heart sore to burn them. British Captain Charles Gordon wrote in a letter home, "In fact, these palaces were so large and we were pressed for that time that we could not plunder them carefully. Quantities of gold ornaments were burned, considered as brass. It was wretchedly demoralizing work for an army. Everybody was wild for plunder." Over 150 years later, it is a loss that China still viscerally remembers, and one that continues to exemplify the destructive force and cultural devastation wrought by colonialism. Yuanming Yuan was first conceived by King Emperor Qianlong. Starting in 1750, the emperor wanted to build an imperial garden that also had spaces for work, recreation, and spirituality, and that would serve as the perfect summer getaway from the heart and the chaos of the Forbidden City. His successors continued to add to his vision and build on the site for every 100 years, and it eventually became the primary residence for the Chinese rulers. If history has shown us anything, it is that one of the sole purpose of the royal families is to display their power, privilege, and above all riches is in a bold and brazen a way of possible. The Qing emperors nailed this vision when they began building their summer place. Although palace is too tame a word for what site eventually held, massive in its sheer size, Yanming Yuan was more like a royal compound or a mini royal city. It was built to both incorporate and promote the natural features of the area, and it ultimately was built around 3 large gardens: the Garden of Perfect Brightness, the Garden of Eternal Spring, and the Garden of Elegant Spring. While the natural surroundings of the area were of utmost importance to the design, that didn't mean it was a tree-hugger's paradise. They were all fixing needed to make an emperor feel right at home. Yanming Yuan contained hundreds of structures, including multiple palaces, libraries, theaters, galleries, and temples. These buildings were stuffed with works of sculpture and art and porcelain. They were jewels and furs and silks and royal amount of gold. to linger over the recollection, but I cannot make you see it. Robert McGee, a chaplain assigned to the British Army in 760, wrote, "A man must be a poet, a painter, a historian, a virtuoso, a Chinese scholar, and I don't know how many other things besides to giving you an idea of it, and I am not approached to any one of them. But whenever I think of beauty and taste, of skill and antiquity, while I live, I shall see before the mind's eye some scene of the grounds, those palaces." In 1860, the Second Opium War was well under the way. The Western forces has been unhappy with concessions they won and the end of First Opium War, so they invaded again in 1856 to force the Emperor's hand. On October 7, 1860, the French pulled up to the gates of Yanming-Yuan, and the fate of the garden was set in motion. The Emperor had recently fled, so the plunder of the royal palace began in full force. When the British arrived a few days later, they were treated to the sight of the raucous French army gallivanting around in their newly ill-begotten finery. British Lieutenant Colonel Garnet Wolseley wrote that, on their arrival, they saw a string of French soldiers going in empty-handed, and another coming out laden with loot of all sorts of kinds. Many were dressed in the rich embroidered gowns of women, and almost all wore worn Chinese hats instead of French kepi. The British quickly rejoined. Plundering this unparalleled sight was a severe cultural scene in its own right. China's treasure were young from their homeland and dispersed throughout the West. Because of the British rules of the plunder, you must be civilized even in your incivility. After all, large auctions of these valuables and antiques were held back to England. So many of these pieces hit the market and caused the fascinating of Westerners that, according to William M. Lee, a project of MIT, the Chinoiserie rage of the mid-19th century was a part of the fueled by the plunder of Yanming-Yuan. Even four-legged creatures weren't safe from the soldiers' stinky fingers. Both the British and the French returned home with the pleasant spoils to spare to their lieges. One of the offerings made to the Queen Victoria was the Pekingese dog that was irreverently named Lucy. According to Chase Bowlby, writing of the BBC, one witness of the cultural carnage observed that officers and men seemed to have been seized with a temporary insanity. Body and soul of they absorbed in one pursuit, which was plunder. In the years that followed and public backlash against the destruction began, the two armies would play a game of pointing at who was responsible, but the final ultimate act of destruction lay firmly with the British. While soldiers were busy looting Yanming-Yuan, a British delegation that included an early foreign correspondent named Thomas Bowlby, an ancestor to the BBC writer, was captured by Chinese officials. By mid-October 19, of the captives were dead. It was clear that they have suffered severe torture at the hands of their leader captors. When Lord Elgin heard of their fate, he saw red. He ordered that entire Yanming-Yuan complex to be burned to the ground in sole act of retribution. The task was so large that, according to Sheila Melvin in the New York Times, it took 4,500 soldiers to set fire on an old summer palace. The only area that partially survived the fury was the slip of the land known as the European section, where buildings and palaces had been built in a Western style, partially using a fire-resistant marble and stone. Those more were the ruins of the Omer would photograph 13 years later. While this was the greatest indignity Yanming-Yuan would suffer, it would not be last. Over the next decade, looting of the few treasures that remained will occur at the hands of locals, Western soldiers, and even the Red Guards of the Cultural Revolution. But as history has marched on, too so have many feeling of loss and regret the wholesome destruction of such incredible treasure. When the emperor exiled from young the fate, a beloved one, and